This is the story of a fella who uses the word fella and kind of messes up.
Gorgeous, baby. You're gorgeous.
This is the Josh Podcast Show, the anti-podcast podcast on God and man. The show that everybody's talking about. The show that will become a necessary part of your weekly mental diet. The show that picks up where JoshRolfe.com leaves off. The show title that uses the word podcast 4 times. Introducing your host, Josh Rolfe.
There was this fella. I didn't know the fella. Most people who use the word fella call a man a fella. But think about it. A fella is simply short for a fellow. And a fellow isn't always a man, as in, you might hear, this fellow was barking at me, where the fellow could be a woman. Okay, maybe not. Maybe you would never call a woman a fellow, but there could be a scenario where there's the fellowship that can be held by a woman, as in the university offers a fellowship opportunity for students to serve in government, and if the woman is in the fellowship, she's called a fellow. But one wouldn't call that kind of fellow a fella. So perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps a fella is never a woman. But back to the fella I didn't know. It seems low, like a low blow, to call this fella a fella. At least knowing what I know now. Because one doesn't call an important person a fella. One doesn't call the president of a nation a fella. But I do want to say something about this certain fella I didn't know, because this seems like a safe place to do so. And I seem to have all the time in the world. 45 years ago, this fellow was 45. Not 45 years old, but 45 days old. But that's probably not really important now. So let me tell you about this fella. And stick with me, because this is a twisted, odd, yet kind of an interesting story, especially for me, and for those of you who like twisted, odd, yet kind of interesting stories. There once was another fella I do have to tell you about before I get to the fella who I didn't know. So like I said, there's this fella I didn't know, and since the beginning of time, I'm sure there have been lots and lots of fellas. Like the fella who isn't the principal subject of this story that I'm about to share, nor is he the other one I just mentioned briefly, but who was one day on an internationally recognized mountain when a fierce yell came from about 50 yards away saying, "Fella!" The rock climber shouted out to him, one frigid cold ice crystals forming when he exhaled that word morning. The man turned to the rock climber and smiled. He was wearing shorts and a t-shirt and didn't look at all as uncomfortable as he should have been, seeing as how they were on top of Mount Everest. He was a strong, almost superhuman fella who could dress for the beach while at the top of Mount Everest. He could dress for the moon when he slept on his bed, for his pajama attire was an astronaut suit. He could dress in a full suit, vest, cufflinks, and all, while surfing, and he would wear nothing to his own surprise birthday party, not coining the term birthday suit, but using and applying the word birthday suit. When he walked into that room of partiers waiting for him in silence, in that hall full of beloved friends and family, they were all sure surprised. I'm stalling. I'm making stuff up now. But I should get back to the original fella. The one I started talking about before veering off to talk about this made-up fella, as well as the other fella, and the word fella. The original fella, who I'm trying to avoid right now. This is the same fella who on Rosh Hashanah, and this is a true story, left the synagogue, but only because it was time to go. This is the same fella who looked inside a kaleidoscope and saw a bunch of colorful shapes, but only because it was daytime. This is the same fella who hated the word fella. He despised the word fella. He was sick of the word fella, so much so that he vowed to kill the next man who called him fella. That's where I come in. You see, I used to call people fella for a living. Men, women, children, pets, everything was fella to me. I didn't discriminate between gender, color, sex orientation, religion, ethnicity, class, caste, club, political affiliation. What have I left out? Everyone was called fella. It was as if I was called by God to call others the word fella, to disseminate the word fella, to ensure that the word fella never fell from ordinary speech. I used it and I used it and I used it some more until that fateful day when I called that certain fella, fella. And he lived up to his word. He lived up to the promise he had made sometime before. I'm not sure when. The vow he had made to literally kill the next person who called him fella. And so he did. I can't remember exactly how. I just remember him saying, after I called him fella, "Hey fella," that's all I said. That he had left a synagogue when it was time to go on Rosh Hashanah. That he was 45 years old and 45 days. That he looked inside a kaleidoscope during the daytime. And that he was sorry. But to be a man of his word, he had to do what he had to do to me, since I had just called him fella. I was very confused by the entire thing. As you can probably tell, you're probably a little confused hearing this. I was especially confused about the kaleidoscope part. And I was kind of looking away until in the corner of my eye, I saw something appear in his hands. I heard a loud noise, like half of it, because it was just cut off abruptly. And then I was here, in this room, asked to fill out this form about how I got here, which I'm doing now.
Thank you for listening to the Josh Podcast Show, the anti-podcast podcast on God and man. For more information, visit joshpodcast.com. Follow Josh on Twitter at Josh Rolfe. That's Rolfe, R-O-L-P as in podcast, H. Now go and have the best day and night ever. And have fun.